Sometimes I think the true weight of life doesn't come from the years we carry, but from the silences we keep for too long. I've kept quiet more than I should have, out of fear, out of shame, and out of that mistaken belief that protecting other people's pain mattered more than healing my own. Now, at 72, I have nothing left to lose, and I know that if I don't speak, my story will vanish with me. That would be unfair, because what we lived as a family might serve as a mirror, a warning, or maybe a comfort for those walking through storms of their own. Before I go on, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. If my words reach you, please like this story and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing memories that too often remain buried. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love imagining these stories traveling far beyond my small house. My name is Adelia Noguera, though here in Texas, everyone just calls me Mrs. Adelia. I've lived in this country for over 40 years, and in my neighborhood I'm known as the widow who waters her plants every afternoon, with her white hair tied back in a simple bun. That serene image fools many. Behind the flowers I tend, and the calm of my hands, are scars you cannot see, marks that weigh heavier than the wrinkles on my face. I chose to speak now because I've carried too long the wound of a son lost to his own choices, a son who strayed far from the good I once dreamed for him. For years I blamed myself, asking where I failed, when my arms stopped being a refuge. But I also learned that not everything is inherited, and not everything can be prevented. Some paths twist, no matter how much love is sown into them. And yet, in the middle of that darkness, a spark of hope appeared. My grandson. At just 13 years old, he showed the kind of courage I, weary and broken, couldn't find in myself. Sometimes I look at him and think the quiet strength I always carried, though I used it only to stay silent, bloomed in him as courage to act. Seeing him face what I never could gave me both pride and relief. My memories intertwine with a past even further back. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, surrounded by dirt roads and sounds that now feel unreal. Childhood taught me the sweetness of simplicity, but also the fragility of life. I learned then that when the foundation of a home breaks, the soul's ground trembles. That lesson followed me, and maybe that's why I understood so well the emptiness in my son when he lost himself. Telling this isn't easy. My hands tremble as I speak, and each word tears away a bit of what I've hidden. But I want to believe that pain, when shared, grows lighter, that my story can become company for someone who today feels alone in chaos. I don't pretend to give lessons, only to open my chest and let out what I've buried too long. So I invite you to listen as if we were face to face, at a small kitchen table, a cup of coffee, between us. Don't expect a perfect or ordered tale. What I want to give you is truth, even if it hurts, even if my voice cracks. Because my truth was born in childhood joy, shattered by loss, darkened by silence, and reborn through the bravery of a child. And that is the story I need to tell today. My childhood began in a small Oklahoma town, where the streets were mostly dirt and the sound of church bells set the rhythm of our days. Our house was modest, with whitewashed walls and a low roof, but it always smelled of cornbread and firewood burning in the stove. I remember waking up to the crowing of roosters and the soft shuffle of my mother moving around the kitchen, while the cool morning breeze slipped through windows without curtains. We didn't have luxuries, but the simplicity of that life felt like a gift from heaven. My father worked from dawn to dusk in the fields. With his roughened hands and stooped back, he came home each night with dust clinging to his clothes, sweat darkening his shirt. Yet his eyes always carried a spark of tenderness when he saw us running toward him. He would scoop all three of us up in his arms as if we weighed nothing, filling the room with laughter and exaggerated stories of what he'd seen among the crops. To me, he was an unshakable giant, though later I'd learn even giants can break. I was the oldest of 3 siblings, which made me a second mother in our little household. While my mom sewed or cooked, I invented games to keep the younger ones busy. Sometimes we made dolls out of scraps of fabric, Other times we built forts from branches in the backyard. Imagination was our wealth. Poverty wasn't a barrier, it was an excuse to create. Every giggle from my brothers felt like treasure in my hands. Afternoons carried their own magic. After lunch, when the heat pressed down heavy, we'd gather under the shade of the pecan tree in the yard. My mother would hum hymns while she stitched, and my father would lean back with a cup of cheap wine, savoring his only rest of the day. I often closed my eyes, wishing time could freeze on that image. My family together, the smell of damp earth after watering the garden, and the feeling that nothing bad could reach us there. The whole town felt like an extension of our home. Neighbors knew each other by name, and kindness was as ordinary as a handshake. If one family lacked bread, another shared theirs. If someone fell ill, everyone came with remedies and prayers. That invisible network held us, making us feel part of something larger than our four walls. It was as if the community itself taught us that survival depended on sharing. My mother was the soul of our house. Small in stature but immense in spirit, she always found a way to stretch what little we had. If food was scarce, she multiplied rice with herbs from her garden. If winter was too harsh, she pieced together quilts from old fabric scraps. Even now, when I smell cinnamon or sage, I am carried back to those afternoons when her soft voice wrapped around us like a blanket. At the one-room schoolhouse with its wooden benches and chipped walls, I learned my first letters. We didn't have shiny new notebooks or pencils to spare, but I felt enormous pride each time I managed to read aloud in front of everyone. Teachers often said I was curious beyond my years, and sometimes they slipped me books to borrow. I devoured them under the weak glow of a kerosene lamp at night, while my brothers listened as if I were reading fairy tales, even when the pages held history or poems. Music was another treasure. My grandfather, who lived nearby, played the harmonica and guitar at family gatherings. With his raspy voice, he sang old country songs about love, loss, and longing. I would sit by his side, watching his fingers move, feeling that every note carried secrets. That music became my refuge, a safe corner of joy I could always retreat to in my mind. Every season carried its own flavor. Spring covered the fields with wildflowers, and we ran barefoot through the grass until our feet were muddy. Summer brought unbearable heat, but we cooled off by splashing in the creek, slipping on the smooth rocks. Fall smelled of harvest and apples, and sometimes my father let us taste the sweet cider before it fermented. Winter was harsh, but it was filled with stories told by firelight, wrapped in quilts that seemed enormous against our small bodies. The church stood at the heart of town, not because we were overly religious, but because it was the meeting place for everything. Sunday services, weddings, bake sales, and town fairs. I still remember the pride of putting on a freshly washed dress and feeling, if only for a few hours, like I belonged to something dignified. That simple dignity became a lesson I carried all my life. With my brothers, I shared a bond of pure complicity. The youngest, barely a baby when I was already dreaming of adulthood, clung to me as if I were his second mother. The middle one was my partner in mischief. We discovered hidden corners, collected bugs, and invented pirate stories together. Protecting them felt like my secret mission, one that would later shape how much I endured for their sake. The town's Saturday market was a feast for the senses. I can still picture the vibrant colors of fresh produce, the tang of cheese in the air, the vendors' voices calling out their prices. My mom held my hand as we walked between stalls, sometimes letting me pick one small treat, maybe a plum or a handful of dried raisins. That tiny choice made me feel like the richest girl in the world. Animals were part of our everyday rhythm. We had chickens, a stubborn mule, and for a while, a loyal dog that followed us everywhere. I grew too attached to them, crying each time one was lost or died. My father would say, "Farm life teaches you to say goodbye, that life and death are always hand in hand on the land." Those words felt cruel then, but in time I saw their truth. On hot summer nights, we dragged our blankets outside and lay under the stars. My father pointed out constellations, weaving stories about heroes and gods who lived in the sky. I listened in awe, feeling the universe open wide above us, so much larger than my small world. Those tales fed my dreams and gave me hope that life could be bigger than what I saw. The best part was the sense of safety. No matter how poor we were, I slept without fear, convinced nothing bad could happen as long as we were together. That certainty was my invisible shield, protecting me even from nightmares. I never imagined it would be shattered with such violence one day, leaving cracks that would never fully close. If I close my eyes now, I can still hear the clatter of forks on the wooden table, my mother's gentle hush when my father spoke, and the laughter of my brothers as we made up silly games. Those sounds formed the melody of my childhood, a melody that turned into memory the moment tragedy entered our home. I once believed happiness was eternal, that nothing could disturb that harmony. But life, in its harshness, taught me differently, and far too soon. Even the brightest memories became clouded by the darkness that followed. The contrast between that innocent joy and the shadow that later consumed us is what still cuts me deepest. For in those sweet days lay a fragility I didn't recognize. We were happy, yes, but our happiness was built on threads too thin. And when those threads snapped, everything came crashing down. The day tragedy entered our home began like any other. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, and my mother was already in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits. I was helping my brothers get dressed for school when a strange, heavy thud echoed from the kitchen. I rushed in and found my mother collapsed on the floor, flour scattered around her hands. Her eyes were still, her body lifeless, as if life itself had slipped away in a single, cruel breath. Chaos followed. My father shouted her name, trying desperately to revive her, while I clutched my brothers, who were crying without understanding what had happened. The silence of the early morning was broken only by sobs and panic. I will never forget the unbearable stillness of that moment. The half-rolled dough on the counter, the coffee still steaming in her cup, and the sudden, brutal absence of the woman who had been the heart of our home. Her funeral came swiftly, as was the way in our town. The small church filled with neighbors bringing flowers and tears. I moved like a shadow, numb, unable to believe my mother would never again hum under the pecan tree or tell us bedtime stories. Her absence sank into me like a stone, stripping away the last trace of childhood innocence. Nothing was the same after that day. My father was never the same either. The strong, affectionate man who once carried us in his arms turned into a hollow figure. He sat for hours at the kitchen table, staring blankly while the bottle of whiskey became his only companion. The fields still needed tending, but his strength was gone. We were left not only motherless, but also without the anchor our father had once been. I was just 14, but suddenly the weight of the household fell on me. Cooking, cleaning, keeping my brothers clothed and fed, it all became my responsibility. I did it without complaint, because there was no choice, but inside I felt an unbearable mix of fear and anger. Fear that I wasn't enough, and anger that life had stolen my mother just when I needed her most. Neighbors tried to help, bringing food or sitting with us when they could, but the emptiness inside our house was impossible to fill. Nights were the worst. My brothers cried for our mother, and I told them she was in heaven watching over us, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. In truth, I felt abandoned by the very sky I prayed to. My father's decline grew sharper as weeks passed. He became irritable, distant, sometimes disappearing into town for hours. Rumors spread quickly. People said he spent too much time in the bar, that he sought comfort in dangerous company. I saw him stumble home, eyes glassy, words slurred, and in my heart bloomed a terrible realization. We were no longer safe. Even inside our own home, the house lost its warmth. Where once laughter had filled the kitchen, now silence and shadows lingered. Every object, my mother's apron hanging on a hook, her Bible still open on the table, was a painful reminder of what we'd lost. I held on to those things desperately, as if they were the last threads tying me to her. Her absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum crept something darker. My father's weakness left us vulnerable, and soon men who had once kept their distance began to circle closer. Old acquaintances, drinking buddies, distant relatives, all offering help, though their eyes told a different story. I didn't yet understand it fully, but I could feel the storm gathering. That was the beginning of our true downfall. My mother's death didn't just take her from us. It cracked the fragile foundation of our family. And through that crack, danger slipped in, changing everything forever. The abuser didn't arrive all at once, but under the disguise of help. It was my Uncle Raymond, my father's younger brother, a man who until then had only shown up at family gatherings or holidays. After my mother's death, he began visiting, more often, always with the excuse of looking after his brother. At first I felt relief, thinking maybe his presence would lighten our burden, but it didn't take long to see his interest wasn't so pure. Raymond's smile always unsettled me. It wasn't warm like my father's once had been, but crooked, like it was hiding something. He came carrying bread, a bottle of whiskey, or tobacco for my father, slowly carving out a place for himself at our table. Neighbors praised him for being generous, calling him a blessing. I bit my lip to keep from screaming the truth. Even before the worst began, I felt a tightening in my chest around him. As my father sank deeper into drink, Raymond slid into the role of protector in the eyes of the town. He started handling chores in the fields and walking my brothers to school when I couldn't. People whispered we were lucky to have him. That public image of savior gave him power, while I felt increasingly trapped in a web nobody else seemed to see. Inside the house, his behavior changed. He lingered with his eyes on me longer than he should have, his silences thick with unspoken threats. His voice took on an authority that didn't belong to him. He told me how to dress, how to speak, even how to walk. "You're nearly a woman now, Adelia," he'd say, in a tone that pretended to be paternal, but chilled me to the bone. I'll never forget the first time I sensed the real danger. He asked me to follow him to the shed, claiming he needed help counting tools. I was 15, but the way he looked at me made me invent an excuse and run back to the kitchen. Nothing happened that day, but the warning carved itself deep inside me. His interest was not in helping, but in controlling. My brothers noticed nothing. To them, Uncle Raymond was the fun uncle who brought candy or taught them to whistle. I, on the other hand, lived under constant watch. At night, when the house grew too quiet, I'd hear his footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if checking that we were all under his control. I'd bury myself under the blanket, pretending to sleep, my heart racing so loudly I feared he could hear it. The town's admiration made him bolder. If I ever hinted that something felt wrong, the response was always the same. "You're imagining things," or "Your uncle just wants the best for you." That disbelief silenced me more than his threats. It taught me that nobody would believe me, that my fear was mine alone to carry. Soon, Raymond began sleeping in our house. First he stayed on the couch, then in a small room near the kitchen. He claimed it was so he could protect us since my father was too fragile. But every night he stayed under our roof, I felt our walls closing in, the home that once sheltered us becoming my prison. With my father so far gone in whiskey, Raymond became the unquestioned authority. He set schedules, decided how our meager resources were spent, and scolded us as if we were his children. My brothers obeyed without question, but I saw the dark satisfaction in his eyes, the thrill of his growing power. The first signs of abuse were subtle: a comment about my changing body, a casual brush of his hand when passing by, orders disguised as advice. I didn't have words for what was happening, but my body understood. My skin crawled every time he was near. One afternoon, as I hung laundry, he leaned close and whispered in my ear, "You need to learn to obey, Adelia. Women who don't end up alone." His voice was low, almost gentle, but full of menace. I stood frozen, trembling hands clutching the wet sheets. That was the first moment I realized how deeply trapped I was. He began restricting my movements. A girl shouldn't be out walking so much, he'd say, forbidding me from visiting friends or neighbors. At the same time, he loaded me with heavy chores, hauling firewood, tending the garden, feeding animals. It wasn't work alone. It was domination, breaking me down piece by piece. At school, my teachers noticed the change. The girl who once answered eagerly now sat quiet, avoiding every question. When they asked what was wrong, I offered excuses. How could I explain something nobody would believe? Shame sealed my lips, and with it came a suffocating silence. Raymond's power was built on fear. He didn't need to shout. A raised eyebrow, a fist slammed on the table, or even a long stare was enough to paralyze me. My brothers never saw it. To them, he was still a protector. That was my greatest torment, knowing if I spoke, I might be called a liar, even by those I loved most. I once overheard women at church talking about him. Such a good man, they said, saving his brother's family from ruin. My stomach burned with rage. They couldn't see that he was the ruin. Their praise gave him armor, while I sank deeper into silence. Nights stretched into endless battles with fear. I slept with one ear open, flinching at every creak of the floorboards. Many nights I didn't sleep at all, sitting in a corner with my knees to my chest, waiting for daylight as if sunlight itself could keep me safe. To survive, I clung to memories of my mother. I imagined her singing under the pecan tree, wrapping me in warmth. But even those memories began to feel poisoned, his shadow seeping into every corner of my mind. There was no refuge left, not even in memory. My father remained blind to it all, or maybe he chose not to see. He welcomed every drink Raymond poured, calling him a faithful brother. I watched with bitterness as the man who had once been my hero shrank into a hollow shell, leaving me unprotected. Raymond's cruelty wasn't just in the present. He planted fear for the future, too. No one will ever want you, he'd say. Without me, you'd have nothing. Those words burrowed deep. Even when I tried to resist, I sometimes believed them. Over time, I saw the pattern. His game was never about care. It was about power. He thrived on my silence, on the tears I swallowed. The more I withstood, the stronger he seemed to feel, and I, caged in his web, wondered how long I could endure before breaking. The cruelest part was the appearance of normalcy. To the world, Uncle Raymond was a savior. To me, he was the predator who had stolen my freedom. That duality was the hardest prison of all, smiling in public while dying inside. His arrival marked the beginning of my captivity. There were no iron bars or locks, but each of his actions closed a cell around me. My adolescence ceased to be a time of discovery and became a battle to survive in his shadow. Silence became my only armor. I learned to measure every word, smooth every expression, lower my eyes when Raymond was near. Any flicker of defiance could trigger his temper, and his temper felt like a cliff's edge. One wrong step and I'd fall. So I practiced stillness, short answers, careful movements, a face that gave away nothing. The clappered walls of our house carried sounds too well. Even a sigh could travel rooms. I trained my breathing to be quiet, my footsteps to be soft, my needs to be invisible. It looked like obedience from the outside, like a girl growing respectful. On the inside, it was constant calculation. How to get through each hour without drawing heat. How to disappear inside my own skin while still keeping my brother's days intact. Survival replaced childhood, and I wore that disguise like a second skin. I started wearing my mother's old cardigans and dresses, clothes a size too big, sleeves hiding my arms, skirts swallowing my shape. Neighbors teased that I dressed like a church lady, but those folds felt like a fortress. Fabric muffled the prickling on my skin when Raymond stared too long. I found a box of safety pins and reworked collars higher, sleeves longer. In summer's burn, I sweated under layers, refusing to give the heat or him any more access to me. Girls at school snickered, calling my outfits prairie relics. I laughed along, cheeks burning, grateful their mockery stopped at the hem. If I looked plain enough, invisible enough, maybe I could move through rooms without catching a hook. I tucked my hair into tight braids, pinned flat, and called it convenient when really it was camouflage. Nights were the worst. Sleep never arrived all at once. It crept, shallow and nervous if it came at all. Every creak of wood became a warning. The hallway seemed to breathe, stretching longer the moment the house went dark. I learned each board's complaint, which groan belonged to the wind and which belonged to footsteps. On those nights, I kept my shoes by the bed and a coat under the blanket, ready to bolt. Sometimes I slept curled beneath the window, hand on the sill, counting breaths between sounds. Other times I slid into the tiny space between the dresser and wall, knees to my chest, convinced that if I shrank small enough, danger would miss me. Morning light felt like forgiveness. Daybreak, a temporary truce. At school, my grades slid like dust off a shelf. Words I once loved scattered when I tried to gather them. I'd start a sentence and lose my place halfway through, the crackle of fear interrupting everything. Teachers asked if I was grieving, and I nodded, grateful for a name that was true and still incomplete. The bell that used to ring me toward curiosity now rang me toward relief, a 50-minute block where Raymond couldn't reach me. But relief was thin. My mind kept rehearsing escape routes, imagining the hallway at night, calculating where to stand, which door to wedge. I sat near windows, watched the parking lot, memorized faces of kind people, hoping I could call one of them to mind in the moment I'd need courage most. My brothers were my compass. Keeping them safe was the arrow that always pointed forward. To them, Raymond was still a provider, someone who fixed the fence and bought candy if they behaved. I made peace with their illusions because innocence is also a kind of shelter. I packed their lunches, checked their homework, smoothed quarrels before Raymond could hear. When they grew rowdy, I turned it into a game that sent them outside, away from his scrutiny. The world wanted me to be a dutiful daughter. Instead, I became a quiet shield. I chose their joy over my outrage, their sleep over my tears. Holding that line cost me pieces of myself, but it kept them whole. I told myself that was a fair trade, even when the math left me empty. Inside our home, Raymond's commands multiplied like weeds. He dictated dinner times, chore lists, even which radio stations were decent. He said structure would save us, though the only thing he saved was his throne. He handed me the heaviest jobs, hauling wood, scrubbing floors on my knees, hauling feed to the coop, like penance for crimes I hadn't committed. The rhythm of work kept my hands busy and my face bent down. It also taught me endurance, how to breathe through ache, how to turn a task into a wall between me and his gaze. I counted strokes, steps, buckets. Work became numbers. Numbers became a narrow road I could walk without looking up. My father faded in the doorway, bourbon breathing for him when he could not. He loved us, I believed that, but grief swallowed him whole and then asked for seconds. Some days he'd look at me as if he wanted to say something brave, then glance at Raymond and swallow it back. I resented him for that swallowed bravery, for letting the bottle speak louder than a father. Then I'd remember his trembling hands at my mother's graveside and feel my anger turn to ash. Forgiveness felt expensive, but resentment felt heavier. I carried both, setting them down where I could, picking them up when the house went still. He was drowning and I was bailing water with a spoon. My body began telling truths my mouth couldn't. I lost weight too fast. My collarbones sharpened like the corners of a secret. Headaches pulsed behind my eyes and my stomach clenched. Tight before dusk, as if night had a smell only it and I could detect. Sometimes hives bloomed across my chest, a red map of alarm bells. I kept a jar of Vicks by the bed and rubbed it like a ritual, as if menthol could cure fear. When neighbors asked, I blamed the heat, the chores, anything but Raymond's shadow. I did not visit the clinic. He'd insist on coming. The idea of sitting on that thin paper with him in the room made my skin pull away from my bones. I created sanctuaries out of corners, the crawl space beneath the porch, where cool air hung like a kept promise, the pantry behind a sack of flour, where the faint dusting on my eyelashes made me look ghost pale in the mirror shard I hid, the abandoned chicken coop where sunlight filtered through slats like a patchwork of small blessings. I cached little comforts there, a pencil nub, a peppermint, a scrap of fabric from my mother's apron. Objects became anchors, proof that softness still existed in a world that felt sandpaper rough. When my breath hitched, I'd press that fabric to my face and borrow the memory of her hands. Silence, which I had adopted as armor, turned out to be a cage with bars I'd welded myself. The longer I wore it, the more it conformed to me, the harder it became to lift. Words stacked at the back of my throat, heavy as stones. Shame laminated them in place. Raymond's voice lived in my head, full of poisonous certainty. No one will believe you. You'll ruin your family. This is what happens to girls who don't behave. I could recite his lines like scripture. Some nights I mouthed the alphabet just to prove I could form shapes, any shapes, with my lips. A whisper is a small rebellion. Even that felt dangerous. Church became theater. I smiled when spoken to, passed the collection plate with steady hands, folded bulletins as if order were a virtue that could save me. Women praised Raymond for stepping up. Men clapped him on the back. I willed myself not to cry when the choir sang Blessed Assurance, because assurance felt like a story for braver people. I caught my reflection in the vestibule window, chin lifted, hair neat, and barely recognized the girl inside. She looked composed. She wasn't. I envied godly words for their clean edges and clear promises. My prayers turned into bargains. Keep my brothers safe, keep my father from falling, keep Raymond out of the hallway. Amen. I mapped Raymond like a storm. Pressure drops, wind direction, the smell of rain in the air. His quiet was worse than his talking. His talking was worse than his laughter. When he whistled low, danger sharpened. When he chewed too carefully, he was planning. I learned to move before his moods did. To be in the yard when he entered the kitchen, to fetch water the minute his boots thudded on the porch. Anticipation isn't freedom, but it's a kind of armor. I wore it until my shoulders ached. Friends peeled away like labels in bath water. I ignored invitations until they stopped coming. When girls asked what was wrong, I smiled and said chores or Daddy needs me, letting duty be my alibi. Truth would have unspooled the whole world. I chose to keep my thread tight. Sometimes I watched them from the classroom window, ponytails bouncing, laughter thrown like confetti, and I ached for their unburdened steps. But envy can slice as quick as it soothes, so I folded it small and tucked it inside, alongside the other feelings I didn't have room to feel. Winter cut through my layers. No matter how many I wore. The house groaned under north winds, shingles rattling like loose teeth. I piled quilts on my brothers and lay awake, listening to the stove tick and settle. Night in winter smells different, metallic, almost medicinal, as if the cold sterilizes everything but fear. I measured time by the drip of the faucet and the slow climb of frost on the window pane. At dawn, I warmed my hands around a mug I barely sipped, just to feel its steadiness against my palms. Warmth is a kind of evidence. I needed proof that softness could still reach me. My posture changed. I kept my chin tucked, shoulders rounded as if smaller meant safer. My voice pitched down to careful, a narrow lane between too quiet and too loud. I rarely laughed. When I did, it sounded wrong in my ears like a borrowed sound. But my hands grew capable, their steadiness a surprise. I could haul, scrub, mend, carry. I was a machine built of girl and grit. There was pride in that, hidden and shy. Pride can be a wick. Given the right flame, it catches. I didn't know it yet, but those steady hands were learning how to hold their ground. For my brothers, I stitched ordinary days out of scraps. Tuesday meant pancakes if flour allowed. Friday meant a tin of cocoa shared 3 ways. When school sent home flyers for field day, I signed permission slips with borrowed confidence and packed sandwiches thick as hope. The world outside our door needed them to be boys, not barometers. So I taught them to whistle, to tie their laces fast, to look people in the eye. I wanted them to carry ease in their pockets, like pebbles for skipping across a pond. If their lives felt light, maybe gravity would let me go for a while. On market days, I moved like a shadow at noon, present but thin. Raymond hovered, hands on his belt, eyes sweeping. He called it supervision. I called it show. I focused on the onion skins curling like parchment and the gleam of apples under dew. Details steadied me. I counted coins twice, thanked vendors, memorized the cadence of safe conversations. A woman from the bakery slipped me a day-old roll sometimes. I held it like a benediction, tore it in half for my brothers behind the feed store, and pretended it tasted of Sunday. Food shared in secret feels holier somehow. I hid small tools in plain sight. A flathead screwdriver wrapped in a rag beneath the sink. A heavy book wedged behind the nightstand. A doorstop tucked into my pillowcase like a talisman. I didn't know if I could use any of them when it mattered. Fear can paralyze even the bravest plans, but knowing where they were slowed my heart when it sprinted. Preparedness isn't courage, but it can borrow its shape long enough to get you to morning. I rehearsed moves in my head. Step, reach, wedge, run. Practice made an invisible path I could trace in the dark. The pages I wrote at night became my truest mirror. I tore them from a grocery ledger and hid them beneath a loose floorboard. Words crawling tight to save. Space. I wrote what I couldn't speak. The list of noises the house makes, the names of girls I missed, the scent of my mother's lotion, the calculus of fear. I wrote prayers without dear and amen, raw requests folded into sentences. Some nights I wrote only one word, enough, and watched it bleed through the paper. Seeing my thoughts sit still made them less monstrous. Monsters lose power when you look them in the eye. Raymond sensed the small changes. He called me sly, accused me of thinking I was better than my raising. A girl with your history should be grateful, he'd say, his voice laced with sugar and threat. Gratitude is a beautiful word until it's used as a leash. I practiced blankness, the face of the well-behaved. Inside something bristled. The part of me that still belonged to me sat up a little straighter, smoothed her skirt, and waited. Guilt rode shotgun with me everywhere. I blamed myself for my father's drinking, as if a better daughter could have stemmed the tide. I blamed myself for my brother's confusion, for every moment their laughter dimmed when the front door opened. I even blamed myself for the way Raymond's presence fouled the air, as if my failure to smile more sweetly had conjured his shadow. Blame is a cruel hobby. It keeps your hands busy so you don't build an exit. I tried to set it down and found it glued to my palms. Sometimes the sun carved out an hour of mercy. Raymond would be in town. The house would breathe like it remembered how. I'd open every window, let air move through rooms that had forgotten the word fresh. I'd hum under my breath, scrub a counter until it gleamed, cut flowers from the ditch and stand them in a jar. Beauty can happen in stolen minutes. I learned to grab it with both hands, to store the feeling like a squirrel stores acorns. You cannot live on beauty alone, but you can live toward it. I trained my senses to sort danger from noise. The grind of the truck on the gravel meant 5 minutes to hide whatever. Joy I'd let out to play. The metallic clink of his belt buckle signaled performance time. Chin down, eyes lowered, yes sir, no sir. The way his boots paused on the threshold told me if he was sober enough for civility or so far gone that even the air would bruise. Data kept me alive. I gathered it relentlessly. If survival had a school, I was valedictorian against my will. Rumors about me reached my ears like postcards from a town I didn't live in. Some said I was stuck up. Others said a bit off since Mama died. One boy declared I had a snake in my pocket because I flinched when he brushed my arm. I wanted to send back a message. I am carrying a thunderstorm and a broken fence and a map you can't see. Instead, I nodded and let their version of me stand in for the one I couldn't explain. Misunderstanding is sometimes safer than truth. Holidays sharpened the edges of our losses. Thanksgiving tasted like absence. Christmas lights reflected in Raymond's glass, not in our eyes. I made decorations from paper bags, cut careful snowflakes, taped them to the window with flour paste like Mama once taught me. My brothers' faces brightened in that soft way children have, where the smallest sparkle becomes a sky. I told myself that if I could make one corner of one room feel like wonder, I was doing my job. Wonder is a stubborn weed. It sprouts even in cracked soil. I developed small rituals of relief, counting to 7 while washing each dish, 3 steps back from any doorway, touching the top of the doorframe with my fingertips when passing through, a secret promise to keep growing. Rituals don't fix fear, but they give it somewhere to sit. In those counted moments, I could feel my own edges again, not just a shadow, not just a girl-shaped apology, someone with a spine, someone whose name sounded like music when I whispered it alone. Evenings required choreography. I maneuvered my brothers into the living room with checkerboards and radio plays when Raymond lingered. In the kitchen, I learned to cook meals that took just long enough to keep him there while we ate elsewhere. If he called my name, I called back, "Be right there," and finished 3 other tasks first, buying seconds that felt like stolen cash. Delay became my craft. I stitched minutes together until they looked like safety from across the room. The marks fear leaves don't always show on skin. Mine lived in flinches I couldn't tame and smiles that didn't reach my eyes. Some mornings I woke with my jaw aching from clenched dreams. I held my toothbrush like a pen and pretended to write calm across the mirror. It fogged with my breath and cleared with the swipe of my palm, the way hope fogs and clears and fogs again. I told the girl in the glass that I believed her. I was the only witness I had. It mattered to say it out loud. I watched the sky for signs. The way clouds stacked over the fields told me if storms would break or skirt us. The way swallows dove at dusk calmed me more than prayer. Creation moves without permission from men like Raymond. That was its comfort. Wind doesn't ask. Rain doesn't bow. Stars don't blink when a bully blusters. Somewhere in that certainty, I found a pulse that belonged to me. I tapped it out on my knee under the table, a drum only I could hear. Time didn't heal, it layered. But under the layers, a thin seam of will hardened. I didn't yet call it courage. Courage felt too loud for the girl I'd become. Still, I noticed the way my hands steadied faster after each fright, the way my thoughts lined up quicker after each lie. I noticed how anger, when held without spilling, turned from acid into fuel. I noticed that love for my brothers kept choosing me, even when I couldn't choose myself. These were measurements no ledger could hold, but they were real. Every night, as I lay down, I repeated a vow so quiet it barely qualified as sound. This is not forever. It wasn't a plan. Plans need doors and money and rides after dark. It was a promise to the part of me that still flickered. Call it a pilot light. Call it a stubborn ember. I pressed my palm to my chest, felt the faint thud beneath bone, and counted it a yes. Somewhere ahead, a threshold waited with my name on it. Until then, I would keep breathing, keep watching, keep the floorboard pages safe. Survival is not a small thing. It is the bravest verb I knew. The first spark of resistance came quietly, almost like a mistake. One summer afternoon, while scrubbing the porch under Raymond's command, I caught myself thinking, he doesn't control everything. The thought startled me, short, defiant, like a pebble tossed at a giant. But it stayed with me, a whisper reminding me there were still corners of myself he hadn't touched. I began to study him the way hunters study prey. Every tilt of his head, every sigh, Every pause between words, I catalogued them like notes in a book. If his boots scuffed twice on the step, it meant anger. If he cleared his throat too much, it meant he was restless. Knowing his rhythms gave me the smallest advantage, enough to move before he struck, enough to buy myself time. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival sharpened into strategy. School became my secret refuge again, not for lessons, but for writing. My English teacher, Mrs. Carter, encouraged me to fill pages with stories. I never told her the truth, but in my essays I poured pieces of it disguised as fiction. A girl trapped in a tower, a storm that swallowed a town. She underlined sentences and wrote, "You have a strong voice." I clung to those words like rope in a flood. There was also Mrs. Green, our elderly neighbor across the road. She watched too closely for Raymond's liking, and once she asked me if things were all right at home. I smiled and nodded, but her eyes narrowed like she didn't believe me. That look, skeptical, caring, gave me a strange comfort. If one person suspected, maybe I wasn't completely invisible. With my brothers, I began weaving my fear into stories. At night I told them about a brave sister who fought off a shadow monster. They laughed, cheering when I invented clever tricks to defeat him. They didn't know the monster lived down the hall, but those tales made me feel like I was rehearsing, practicing courage in secret code. One night, when Raymond ordered me to stay in the kitchen with him, I called for my brothers to help. I made it sound like fun. Let's all make cornbread together. Their presence shielded me. He never revealed his worst side when they were watching. From then on, I found excuses to keep them near me, using their laughter as a guardrail against his darkness. I also began to tuck away small weapons, a hammer behind the woodpile, a kitchen knife beneath the loose plank in my room, a heavy book wedged under my pillow. I didn't know if I had the strength to use them, but just knowing they were there gave me back a sliver of control. It was my private arsenal, my declaration that I wasn't entirely helpless. The journal pages under my floorboard filled faster. My words grew sharper, less like cries and more like plans. I wrote down steps, who I might tell, how I might run, where I could hide. Some pages were angry prayers, others just single words scrawled over and over. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Each stroke of the pencil felt like a crack in his grip. Raymond started noticing the change. He accused me of acting high and mighty, of thinking I was too good for his house. His taunts were laced with venom, but I saw something new in his eyes, unease. He was used to fear, not resistance. Even the smallest defiance unsettled him. That knowledge became my secret weapon. In church, I often clenched my fists when neighbors praised him. I imagined standing up and shouting the truth. The words never left my throat, but the fire inside me grew hotter each time. I promised myself that one day, somehow, his mask would fall. The thought of his downfall kept me steady in the pews, hymns humming over my quiet rage. I paid attention to whispers in town, too. Stories about men being arrested, about women finally speaking up. I soaked in every detail, building an invisible map of possibilities. Fear still chained me, but now I knew there were doors. Maybe locked, maybe far away, but doors all the same. Mrs. Green once told me, almost in passing, "Child, your eyes are shouting something your mouth won't say." I laughed it off, but those words echoed for weeks. They told me that even in silence, my truth leaked out. I wasn't as erased as I thought. That alone gave me strength to keep holding on. Each night, as I lay in bed, I whispered a promise. This will not last forever. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't even a plan. It was a vow, a seed planted in my chest that no one could take. And slowly, that seed sprouted into the will to fight, even if the battle was still far ahead. I was no longer just surviving. I was resisting, quietly, carefully, but resisting all. The same, and with every small act, I was reclaiming pieces of myself, preparing for the moment when silence would finally break. The breaking point came on a breathless summer night, when the heat clung to the walls like a warning. Windows lifted, curtains barely moved, the whole house holding its breath with me. I heard his boots in the hallway, measured, unhurried, the sound of someone certain of his dominion. The doorknob turned with a slow, deliberate click that felt like a verdict. I was out, of bed before the latch cleared, heart sprinting ahead of my body. My fingers found the hammer I kept beneath the frame, its handle worn smooth by secret rehearsals. I stood where moonlight could claim my face, where he'd see I wasn't sleep or shadow. The room smelled of laundry soap and fear. "Stop," I said, and my voice shocked me with its steadiness. He opened the door anyway, and the air thinned to a wire. I lifted the hammer to eye level, both hands steady, elbows locked the way I'd practiced. "One more step and I'll swing," I told him, words shaped like steel. He smirked first, a lazy curl that had always worked on me before. But something in me had hardened since the last time he'd tested the lock. I remembered my mother's hands, the way they never shook when cutting bread, no matter how thin the loaf. I borrowed that steadiness now and let it settle in my bones. "You're a child," he sneered, trying to shrink me back into the smallness he preferred. I widened my stance, planted my feet like fence posts, and repeated, "One more." He advanced half a shoe length, perhaps to prove he could, perhaps to savor my flinch. I didn't flinch. I raised the hammer higher, felt the muscles in my shoulders engage, felt the clean line of consequence hang between us. His eyes flicked to my wrists, to the set of my jaw, to the open window where a neighbor's porch light glowed. He did the math. He tasted the risk of blood and witnesses. "Put it down," he ordered, a little less sure, like a driver who finally sees the cliff in fog. "No," I said, and the word felt like a hinge swinging a door toward daylight. The hallway seemed to bend around his hesitation. I let the silence work for me. He retreated first, one slow step, then another, cheeks hot with a humiliation he feared more than God. The door slammed, rattling the frame, but I didn't lower the hammer until the hallway stilled. I slid the chair under the knob, wedged the doorstop, and only then allowed my knees to soften. Tears arrived, sudden and fierce, but behind them stood something new, a spine I hadn't known I owned. I paced the room to shake the trembling from my hands, then wrote 3 words on a scrap torn from my ledger. "I am possible." I tucked the paper under the floorboard with the others, pressed my palm to the plank, and felt the faint drum of my own courage answer back. Morning wore a costume. He poured coffee like a man who had slept well and said grace with his head bowed low. My father blinked through the steam, oblivious to the night's fault line. I buttered toast, eyes on the knife, and tracked the slight twitch in Raymond's jaw. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Power had slipped, if only by inches, and he could feel the draft. I cleared dishes at a speed that looked ordinary. Inside, a clock I'd wound myself began to tick steady. When he left for town, I watched the dust rise behind the truck and counted to 100. At 99, I tied my hair tight, pocketed my ledger scrap, and stepped across the threshold with a plan that fit like a borrowed coat, loose but covering what mattered. Mrs. Green opened her door before I knocked twice, as if she had been listening for my bones. I didn't tell everything. Truth can drown a listener. But I told enough. The words tasted like rust leaving a pipe. She set 2 cups on the table and reached for my hand, her grip dry and sure. "Sugar or flour?" she said softly. "That's what you'll ask for if you need me to come. Right now." We rehearsed it once, as if it were a hymn. She walked me to her phone and scribbled numbers I already knew by heart. The church office, the school, her sister across town. "You are not invisible," she added, eyes stern with kindness. I felt the sentence settle on my shoulders like a shawl. Useful, warm, something I could keep. At school, Mrs. Carter noticed the way my voice had edges now. I told her more than I'd told anyone, but not enough to break. She listened without interrupting, then unfolded a map of small, careful steps. We would have signals, a red ribbon tied to my satchel if I needed her to walk me home, a note folded twice left in the dictionary if something urgent shifted. she would speak to the counselor quietly. The janitor, who knew the sound of every door in that building, would watch the street at dismissal. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a net with threads tight enough to catch a falling girl without letting the whole town see. I exhaled, like I'd been holding my breath since Christmas. Raymond felt the net he couldn't see. Predators know when the woods have changed. He grew erratic, polished his savior act brighter for the neighbors, and snapped at me over nothing once the door clicked shut. He cut my chores into thinner slices so I'd never finish, a tactic meant to fray me. I refused to ravel. When he boasted at church about fixing our fence, I watched the preacher's eyes flick, one beat longer on me than on him. I stood a little taller in that borrowed beat. The world had not turned against me. It had simply been sleeping. Now it stirred. Perhaps the stirring would be enough. Another night, the knob turned again, not as bold, more probing, like a hand testing ice. I slid the chair under the latch and wedged the stop with my heel, the motions smooth from practice. My brothers woke to my breath, hitching and padded across the floor, hair rumpled, fear bright in their faces. "It's just the wind," I said, and then, lower. "We sleep together tonight." I made a nest for them on my bed and took the spot closest to the door, hammer within reach, heart loud but measured. I taught them a knock, 3 quick, 2 slow. That meant it's me. I made the monsters in their heads smaller by naming them weather. The monster in the hallway could wait. The next morning I arrived at school early, met Mrs. Carter outside the office where no one lingers. We folded the truth again, this time with the counselor present, careful. Corners, no loose edges to catch gossip. They spoke of options, a welfare check couched as concern, a visit from the deputy who sang in the choir, a spare sofa if I needed one without questions. I shook my head at the sofa, the boys, but nodded at the deputy and the check. Sunlight pressed through frosted glass, the kind that blurs outlines into mercy. "You won't do this alone," the counselor said, and I realized how long I'd assumed I must. We set the evening like a table. My brothers invited too. Mrs. Green's for a pie lesson, their excitement a perfect alibi. I packed flour and laughed at her jokes about crust while we hid our plan inside the crumbs. The deputy would park down the road, hood up like a man with car trouble, eyes on our porch. Mrs. Carter would call at 7 sharp. If I didn't answer, she'd ring again and then come by with hymnals to return. My job was to hold my ground without lighting the fuse too early. I wore my mother's cardigan and tucked courage into the pocket, like a handkerchief. Even fear can be folded neatly when it has a place to go. He came home late, whiskey loud in his breath, kindness rehearsed and thin. The house was quiet without the boys, the kind of quiet that shows every crack. He knocked on my door because he liked doors better than walls. Doors imply permission. I stepped into the hallway before he could touch the knob, hammer at my side, but not raised. "Leave this room, Uncle Raymond," I said, plain and audible, each word carrying like a bell. Porch lights snapped on across the road. The phone rang exactly on time. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. The deputy's silhouette shifted at the curb. Raymond looked from me to the window, calculating witnesses and outcomes. His mouth worked, but no words came. The mask didn't slip. It shattered. He turned and fled down the hall, keys jangling, pride cutting his feet on the way out. If this moment stirred something in you, the sound of a girl finding her voice, the sight of a door, finally held from the inside, I want to ask for a small kindness. Please tap the like button and subscribe, not for numbers, but so this story travels farther than my street. When you do, the platform shows it to someone who may be standing in her own hallway right now, hammer in hand, wondering if her voice will hold. Your click is a lantern passed along, a quiet way of saying, "I see you. Keep going." And if you feel moved, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I picture these words crossing counties and cities like porch lights flicking on one by one, until the dark remembers it isn't the only thing here. The breaking point wasn't only the hammer raised or the porch lights waking. It was the moment truth entered the room and refused to leave with him. It was plans whispered into cups of tea, signals tied to satchels, neighbors who decided to be neighbors in more than name. After that night, nothing could return to its former shape, not even my fear. I had witnesses. Now, and witnesses make a different world. I slept with the hammer still near, but I slept. The road ahead wouldn't be free of turns, yet I could see it, a narrow ribbon pulling toward morning, and I knew, at last, that I would follow it. Raymond never reclaimed the power he once held over me. His stare still carried menace, but it no longer landed in the same way. He avoided me more and more, leaving the house for long stretches, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Neighbors began to notice his absence, and though no one said it aloud, I knew the whispers had started to shift. The man once seen as a savior was now being looked at with different eyes. For me, that was enough. He had lost his mask, and with it, the grip he kept on my silence. The quiet support around me grew into something stronger. Mrs. Green, with her watchful gaze, and Mrs. Carter, with her careful plans, became my lifelines. They never pushed me to say more than I could, but they stayed close, making sure I knew I had places to turn. The deputy who parked down the road a few nights in a row never knocked, but his presence alone felt like a wall between me and danger. That net of protection, woven gently and discreetly, gave me back air I didn't realize I had been missing. My brothers began to understand pieces of the truth. They didn't know the whole of it, but they saw enough. The night of my shouts, the way I guarded them from the dark. They grew protective in their own way, slipping into my room more often, sitting closer at church, asking fewer questions but offering more comfort. Their loyalty reminded me why I had endured, why I had carried the silence so long, to preserve what childhood I could for them. My father never fully returned from the fog of his grief. I don't think he ever could. He remained distant, swallowed by the bottle, and though a part of me raged at his absence, another part learned to forgive. He was a broken man who had lost his compass the day my mother died. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it loosened its hold on me. Forgiveness became less about excusing him and more about freeing myself. The years that followed carried scars, but also strength. I came to understand that silence can shield, but it can also suffocate. It was only when I spoke, first with a hammer in my hands, then with trembling words to neighbors, that I began to breathe fully again. That lesson carved itself into me. The voice we think is weakest can be the very key to survival. Now looking back at 72, I feel a strange kind of pride. Not because I was fearless. I wasn't. I shook. I cried. I doubted. But in the end, I acted. I refused to be erased, and in doing so, I gave my brothers a chance to grow up freer than I did. That is enough for me. Survival, after all, is its own kind of victory. If this story touched something inside you, I ask for a simple favor. Like this video, subscribe, and share it. These gestures may seem small, but they carry this truth further to someone who might need to hear it at their own breaking point. Your support gives me strength to keep speaking the words I once buried in silence. And now I leave you with an invitation. Tell me in the comments what you felt as you listened. Because stories are not just memories, like they are bridges. And after so many years of carrying this one alone, I want to walk that bridge with you.